Forbes now estimates there are 2,781 billionaires worldwide, but history shows that status isn't permanent. Fortunes worth tens of billions can collapse in months, leaving nothing behind but lawsuits, debts, and broken reputations. Becoming a billionaire is rare, but losing it all once you've reached that peak is even more astonishing. In this video, we'll look at 21 dramatic downfalls. Some crashed through fraud, others through reckless leverage, family feuds, weak corporate governance, or reputational spirals fueled by social media. Along the way, we'll uncover lessons anyone can apply to protect their own finances. Let's begin with perhaps the most infamous collapse of the modern crypto era. SAM BANKMAN-FRIED, crypto king to courtroom collapse. SAM BANKMAN-FRIED's trajectory from tech prodigy to convicted fraudster is one of the starkest reversals in modern finance. Once celebrated as the figure who could bring cryptocurrency into the financial mainstream, he commanded global attention as the founder of FTX, a platform valued at more than $30 billion at its height. With a projected paper fortune in the low tens of billions, reported at peak, he cultivated the image of a disheveled but brilliant innovator, glued to his laptop and championed by celebrities, athletes, and institutional investors. For a brief period, the narrative around him was that of an unstoppable pioneer who had cracked the code of digital assets. That illusion disintegrated almost overnight. As doubts about FTX's solvency spread, customers rushed to withdraw their funds, only to discover billions of dollars were missing. Investigations revealed a hidden web of financial ties to Alameda Research, where customer deposits had been diverted into risky bets and speculative trades. Instead of carefully protected holdings, client money was exposed to extraordinary risk, fraud on a scale that prosecutors later estimated at around $8 billion. For ordinary users and large investors alike, the crash meant watching life savings evaporate within hours. What stood out in the aftermath was how poorly controlled FTX had been behind the scenes. Reports later described a chaotic internal response, with little in the way of record-keeping, oversight, or corporate governance. Combined with lavish branding, celebrity endorsements, and a flood of marketing dollars, the enterprise had projected stability while lacking the structural safeguards of a real financial institution. By the time the dust settled, it was clear the operation had run more on charisma and hype than on sound practices. For viewers, the takeaway is clear: trust the governance and custodial structures of a financial platform, not just the story its founder tells. SAM BANKMAN-FRIED went from the promise of reshaping finance to serving a 25-year prison sentence, his reputation permanently destroyed. His downfall showed that in the absence of accountability, even a company at the center of global attention can collapse in days and wipe out billions. And as shocking as this case was, it was not the only empire in crypto to unravel under the same pressures of confidence and regulation. Changpeng Zhao, the Binance implosion. Changpeng Zhao, better known as CZ, offers another clear example of how fast unimaginable wealth can disappear when the foundations of a business collide with regulatory power. As the founder of Binance, he dominated crypto trading for years, overseeing the platform's rise from its 2017 launch into the largest exchange in the world. His influence was immense. Analysts often noted how his public statements could shift market sentiment and move prices within hours. By the early 2020s, Binance was processing more transactions than all of its closest competitors combined, and CZ's personal fortune was measured in the tens of billions. To many, his position at the top of the crypto industry seemed untouchable. That sense of permanence was quickly dismantled once regulators increased their scrutiny. Agencies in the United States and Europe began targeting Binance for alleged violations of anti-money laundering rules, gaps in licensing, and questions about how customer assets were handled. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission both filed cases outlining serious compliance failures. In Europe, regulators froze or restricted entire lines of business until corrective actions were taken. The steady tightening of oversight meant Binance went from expansion to retrenchment, hit by lawsuits, suspensions, and penalties. The consequences came at multiple levels. Assets were frozen during legal disputes, major jurisdictions refused new approvals, and corporate partners walked away. Ordinary customers who once trusted Binance for broader access to crypto began withdrawing funds and moving to competitors. As confidence drained, so did revenue, and Zhao's fortune contracted by tens of billions. His resignation as CEO in late 2023, combined with a guilty plea on U.S. anti-money laundering charges, underscored how direct the pressure had become. The accompanying $4 billion settlement with U.S. regulators marked one of the largest fines the crypto industry has ever seen. The deeper cause of this implosion was a belief that scale alone could shield Binance from the consequences of enforcement. But regulatory risk only grows with business size, and relying on influence or market share is no substitute for compliance. Zhao's fall showed that even the largest exchanges must respect established legal frameworks. And as we turn from crypto to traditional business tycoons, another story illustrates how even legacy wealth can unravel with astonishing speed. Anil Ambani, the billionaire who burned $42 billion. Anil Ambani's rise and fall is one of the most staggering examples of wealth destruction in modern business. After the death of his father, Dhirubhai Ambani, in 2002, the absence of a will triggered a bitter dispute with his elder brother Mukesh over the Reliance empire. Their mother ultimately divided the assets, leaving Anil in control of significant holdings in telecom, power, and financial services under the Reliance Anil Dhirubhai Ambani Group. For a brief period, it looked like the younger brother had the upper hand. By 2008, Anil was ranked as the sixth richest person in the world, with an estimated fortune of $42 billion. He was often described as urbane, investor-friendly, and attuned to high-growth industries. Investors poured billions into his ventures, betting on India's booming economy and his ambitious expansion plans. On paper, he had secured one of the largest fortunes in Asia, but his empire was built on shaky foundations. Much of the expansion was fueled by aggressive borrowing rather than steady operating income. As debt piled up, the companies under his group struggled to generate returns. Telecom ventures ran into losses, power projects lagged behind expectations, and his financial services ventures failed to meet projections. When corruption scandals and regulatory probes surfaced in the early 2010s, investor confidence shattered. His listed companies lost more than 90% of their market value, cementing his reputation as one of the fastest destroyers of shareholder wealth. The decline turned into crisis when creditors pursued repayment. In 2019, Ambani faced a contempt of court ruling over unpaid debts to Ericsson, which he had personally guaranteed. Jail time loomed until Mukesh, the very brother he once feuded with, stepped in to cover the dues. The strain deepened in 2020, when a UK court ordered him to pay $716 million to 3 Chinese banks. Ambani declared his net worth negative, admitting that his liabilities exceeded his remaining assets. From a crowned billionaire to insolvency, the contrast could not have been more complete. His story illustrates a sharp lesson. Inheritance and ambition cannot substitute for sound governance, realistic forecasts, and prudent risk control. The reckless use of debt left Ambani vulnerable, and once confidence broke, the collapse was irreversible. Where his fall came from leverage and mismanagement, others would rise and fall through psychology alone, in some cases winning and losing fortunes multiple times within a single lifetime. Jesse Livermore, When Gambling Meets Finance. Jesse Livermore's career shows how brilliance in trading can be undone by the same instincts that once created wealth. Born in 1877, he gained his start in bucket shops, betting on stock price movements without actually owning shares. By his late teens, he was already making significant money, thanks to his sharp memory for prices and a natural ability to spot short-term shifts in momentum. Early success convinced him he could consistently outthink the market, a belief that shaped everything that followed. By the early 1900s, Livermore had graduated into Wall Street trading rooms, where his appetite for risk quickly became legendary. During the panic of 1907, he made millions by shorting falling stocks, then reversed his positions to capture the rebound. His fame grew as newspapers hailed him as a new type of trader, someone who thrived on volatility. That reputation culminated in 1929, when he quietly built massive short positions across numerous brokerage accounts. When the market collapsed, his profit exceeded $100 million, around $1.5 billion in today's money. The press labeled him the Great Bear of Wall Street, and his financial gain was so vast that he required bodyguards due to public anger from those who blamed him for worsening the crash. Yet even at the height of success, Livermore's pattern was already clear. He filed for bankruptcy 3 separate times, each the result of heavy leverage, overconfidence, and an inability to walk away once positioned. Instead of converting his winnings into lasting enterprises, he often risked most of it again. By the late 1930s, the man once recognized as one of the sharpest. Market Minds was trying to sell a trading system, carrying debts greater than his remaining assets. Stripped of both wealth and influence, he ended his life in 1940 at the age of 63, leaving behind liabilities that exceeded what he owned. The enduring lesson is not his moments of genius, but his lack of discipline. Extreme leverage and volatility can break even the most talented traders if they fail to impose limits. Livermore's final chapter is a reminder that wealth built on unchecked speculation is fragile, a warning echoed not only in trading, but in the promises of high-profile entrepreneurs who follow. Elizabeth Holmes, Silicon Valley's fabricated fortune. Elizabeth Holmes built her reputation not on market timing, but on technology that was never real. As the founder of Theranos, she claimed to have created machines capable of running hundreds of medical tests from just a few drops of blood. It sounded like a revolution in healthcare, faster, cheaper, and less invasive diagnostics that could empower patients and reshape medicine. Investors committed hundreds of millions, and the press celebrated her as Silicon Valley's next great visionary. At its height, Theranos reached a private valuation of $9 billion, with Holmes's paper wealth estimated in the billions, making her the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. Her image was central to the company's rise. Holmes deliberately styled herself as a tech icon, adopting Steve Jobs' signature black turtlenecks, building a mythology around her Stanford dropout story, and creating a workplace culture heavy on secrecy and loyalty. Employees later described how unusual the internal environment was, with strict controls on information. To the outside world, however, she appeared composed, confident, and relentlessly focused on the mission of transforming healthcare delivery. The reality, uncovered by whistleblowers and later confirmed by reporting in the Wall Street Journal, was very different. Theranos devices could not deliver accurate results, and behind the scenes, the company relied on traditional laboratory equipment for many of the tests it marketed as groundbreaking. Concerns raised by staff were suppressed, and critical data was hidden from partners and regulators. Eventually, lawsuits were filed by business partners and patients who had relied on test results that turned out to be deeply flawed. The more scrutiny Theranos faced, the clearer it became that the breakthrough it claimed never existed. By 2018, Holmes and her company were formally charged with fraud, accused of misleading investors and endangering patients with false claims. After a lengthy legal process, she was criminally convicted, her personal wealth was erased, and the company she built ceased to exist. The very traits that once fueled her image, boldness, secrecy, and relentless confidence, had become proof of deception. For viewers, the lesson here is straightforward. Never confuse hype with substance. Independent verification, regulatory oversight, and real product validation matter far more than a persuasive story or carefully crafted image. And Holmes was hardly alone in using image and narrative to lure billions. Another founder would soon take that approach to even more extravagant heights. Adam Neumann, WeWork's unicorn illusion. Adam Neumann transformed himself into one of the most visible entrepreneurs of the 2010s by convincing investors that WeWork was more than a real estate company. He sold a lifestyle and growth narrative while the underlying leases and cash flows didn't support the valuation. At its height, WeWork carried a private valuation reportedly near $47 billion, turning a co-working venture into one of the most closely watched startups in the world. Investors saw bright, open spaces filled with freelancers and startups, and assumed they were looking at the future of work. Behind the vision, however, the economics faltered. WeWork locked itself into long-term building leases while offering short-term flexibility to tenants, a mismatch that drained cash with every quarter. Expansion into new cities happened at breakneck speed, but revenue lagged behind ballooning obligations. Neumann's personal conduct added to investor concern. He pushed side ventures in residential living, invested company money in pet projects like schools and wave pools, and even arranged for WeWork to lease properties he himself owned. These choices created clear conflicts of interest and layered financial instability on top of already fragile unit economics. The breaking point arrived in 2019 during the long-awaited IPO. The required disclosures exposed not only staggering losses, but also Neumann's unusual control provisions and erratic governance. Investors who once embraced his charisma recoiled at the numbers on paper. The lofty valuation cracked, falling from nearly $47 billion to just a fraction of that within months. The IPO collapsed, funding dried up, and Neumann was forced to resign as CEO under pressure from the company's largest backers. In the end, WeWork became a cautionary tale. Brand energy and rapid scale built a narrative powerful enough to attract tens of billions of dollars. But without sustainable unit economics, without each new lease and tenant dealing adding stability, the model collapsed under its own weight. For anyone evaluating startups, the warning is clear. Growth must be anchored in durable operations, not just an inspiring story or a magnetic founder. WeWork's unraveling showed how hype and optimism can convince even seasoned investors to overlook fundamentals. The next story reveals what happens when the illusion isn't about growth projections, but about returns that appeared flawless on the surface. Bernie Madoff, the infamous Ponzi architect. Bernie Madoff remains perhaps the most well-known example of how financial credibility can mask deception on an unprecedented scale. A former chair of the Nasdaq, he was not simply a trader, but a figure woven into the fabric of Wall Street itself. Charitable foundations, universities, hedge funds, and wealthy families trusted him with their money, believing his calm demeanor and sterling resume set him apart from riskier ventures. His stature reassured investors and allowed the largest Ponzi scheme in history to remain hidden for decades. Madoff's offer was strikingly straightforward. Clients were told their money would earn steady, consistent returns, year after year, regardless of market swings. To people tired of volatility, his statements looked like the safe middle ground between bonds and equities, reliable income without fear of collapse. Monthly account reports supported that perception, reinforcing the illusion of stability. Over time, too many institutions trusted the appearance of smooth results, and too few demanded full transparency of how they were achieved. The unraveling came in 2008. With the global financial crisis deepening, clients rushed to pull out funds, and Madoff could no longer cover the redemptions. What had looked like decades of successful investing was revealed to be nothing more than cash from new investors funneled to pay earlier ones. The theft totaled an estimated $17.5 billion in principal. With fabricated statements factored in, investors believed at one point they had lost closer to $60 billion. Pensioners, philanthropies, universities, and family offices all discovered they had tied their financial futures to numbers that were never real. In court, Madoff admitted the scheme and received a 150-year prison sentence. He spent the remainder of his life behind bars, dying in 2021. In the years that followed, trustees worked to claw back assets from those who had withdrawn more than they invested, with more than $14 billion ultimately recovered for victims. Even so, many lives and institutions were permanently damaged, their plans and legacies erased overnight. The broader warning is simple. Promises of steady, guaranteed returns should always raise alarm. Investors must demand independent custodianship of funds, verified audits, and transparency in operations. Without those safeguards, even the most reassuring figure can be concealing disaster. And as damaging as Madoff's scheme proved to be, he was not the only high-profile financier to build a fortune on false trust. Another man, celebrated with titles and prestige, would soon face a fall every bit as devastating. Alan Stanford, billionaire knight turned prisoner. Alan Stanford once presented himself as a billionaire financier with the trappings of global respectability. He flew in private jets, sponsored international cricket tournaments, and showcased estates across the Caribbean. Awarded a knighthood in Antigua, he used symbols of prestige to reinforce an image of stability and power. To investors, he looked like a trustworthy steward of wealth, but the fortune he claimed to command turned out to rest on one of the largest Ponzi schemes ever uncovered. At the core of Stanford's operation was his offshore bank in Antigua. Through it, he sold certificates of deposit that promised steady, well above market returns, supposedly backed by safe, conservative investments. Marketing materials emphasized security, tradition, and prudence, drawing in billions from retirees, professionals, and international clients who wanted consistent income. What customers saw were glossy brochures and polished assurances of financial discipline. In reality, investor money was diverted to extravagant personal spending, and to cover withdrawals requested by earlier depositors. The appearance of wealth and authority only intensified the deception. Stanford maintained fleets of aircraft and yachts, underwrote expensive sports sponsorships, and highlighted his Sir title as proof of integrity. For many clients, those outward displays silenced doubts about returns that no regulated bank would have guaranteed. By the time questions arose, billions had already disappeared. The scheme unraveled after the 2008 financial crisis, when investors sought redemptions that the bank could not honor. Regulators soon discovered that the securities meant to safeguard deposits simply did not exist. Instead, client funds had been spent or recycled through fictitious reports. In 2009, authorities charged Stanford with orchestrating a $7 billion fraud, and by 2012 he was convicted and sentenced to 110 years in prison. His wealth, reputation, and empire collapsed in full view, leaving victims with devastating losses that may never be completely recovered. The lesson is direct. Unusually high, guaranteed returns are a warning sign. Investors should confirm whether products are insured or regulated, such as by the FDIC in the United States, and avoid entrusting savings to offshore banks offering too good to be true rates. When credibility is built only on image, the risks are greatest. This kind of misplaced trust devastated thousands of savers, but other collapses came from unfulfilled promises of growth and wealth creation on a national stage. Ike Batista, Brazil's $30 billion mirage. Brazil's most notorious boom and bust tale centers on Ike Batista, a man once hailed as the face of the country's economic rise. During the commodities surge of the late 2000s, he convinced investors that Brazil was poised to rival the world's top energy powers. At his peak in 2011, Batista's fortune was estimated at around $30 billion, ranking him among the wealthiest men alive. Every company in his EBX group carried the letter X, a symbol he said represented the multiplication of wealth. The centerpiece was OGX, his oil exploration firm, which promised to unlock enormous reserves off Brazil's coast and cement the country's standing in global energy. The reality proved far less impressive. OGX had announced aggressive production forecasts, but the wells failed to deliver. As drilling results disappointed, enthusiasm among shareholders vanished. By 2013, investors realized that projected billions in revenue were unlikely ever to materialize. Debt mounted quickly, and Batista's once soaring companies lost most of their value. OGX filed for bankruptcy protection later that year, marking one of the largest corporate failures in Latin America. From there, the collapse accelerated. By 2015, court filings revealed Batista's net worth had swung negative, with liabilities exceeding any remaining assets. The story no longer centered on a charismatic billionaire with bold promises, but on a fallen magnate struggling to fend off creditors. The collapse shook global investors who had treated his ventures as a proxy for Brazil's growth in the resource sector. It also eroded confidence in the broader narrative that commodity-led expansion could insulate economies from systematic risk. Legal consequences followed. Brazilian prosecutors charged Batista with insider trading, corruption, and money laundering linked to his company's operations. In a landmark case, he was found guilty of bribing a senior Rio de Janeiro official and was later sentenced to 30 years in prison. What had begun as a story of national pride ended in financial ruin and criminal conviction. The lesson from Batista's trajectory is clear. Promises in resource exploration must be tested against verified production and credible financial planning. Branding and ambition may create temporary momentum, but without hard evidence, optimism can turn to collapse. His downfall shows how overconfidence in a single vision can destroy fortunes, an error mirrored in other parts of the world through very different industries and circumstances. Sean Quinn, the gambler who owned Ireland. Sean Quinn's story stands out as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern European business. Born into a modest family in County Fermanagh, he began by hauling gravel, gradually building Quinn Cement into a leader in the Irish construction industry. From there he expanded into glass, packaging, insurance, and hospitality, becoming Ireland's richest man with an estimated net worth of more than €3 billion by the mid-2000s. To many in his community, Quinn symbolized self-made success and provided tens of thousands of jobs across the border counties. But at the height of his empire, Quinn made one gamble that would undo everything. Seeking even faster growth, he built up an enormous stake in Anglo-Irish Bank, at one point controlling nearly a quarter of its stock. To finance the position, he borrowed heavily, including loans from Anglo itself, totaling billions of dollars. The bank, already a poster child of Ireland's overheated property market, depended on the same bubble that Quinn's investment exposure now tracked. What seemed like bold vision was actually a concentrated bet on a single counterparty at the peak of a fragile market. When the Irish housing bubble burst in 2008, Anglo-Irish Bank collapsed. The government was forced into a bailout worth tens of billions, and the shares Quinn had amassed became worthless. Because many of his loans were secured with parts of his own businesses, creditors swooped in. In trying to salvage the situation, Quinn pledged more assets, only accelerating the disassembly of his group. Companies that had looked stable for decades were pulled apart under the weight of bad debt and fire sale restructuring. Investors, employees, and the state felt the consequences of his failed bet. By 2011, Quinn declared bankruptcy with reported assets of less than £50,000. The man once viewed as Ireland's business champion would later serve prison time for contempt of court during disputes over hidden property transfers. In Irish business and media circles, his rise and collapse remain emblematic of the Celtic Tiger's excesses, rapid debt-fueled expansion that left devastation when the cycle turned. The lesson in Quinn's downfall is clear. Never expose both personal wealth and corporate foundations to a single highly leveraged bet. His story shows how tying too much to one asset, or one bank, can erase an empire. And as Ireland discovered, this risk was not limited to one businessman, but would grow far greater when entire national banking systems faced the same fate. Jorgalfur Gudmundsson, Iceland's banking collapse. Jorgalfur Gudmundsson became one of Iceland's most recognized businessmen during the mid-2000s, rising from local prominence to the international stage. Domestically, he held the chairmanship of Landsbanki, Iceland's second-largest bank at the time. Abroad, his ownership of London's West Ham United Football Club gave him visibility and prestige, symbolizing Iceland's ambitious reach into European finance and culture. To many, Gudmundsson appeared untouchable, wealthy, well-connected, and emblematic of a small nation suddenly operating as a global player. His fortune tracked the rapid expansion of Iceland's banking system. Landsbanki and its peers offered unusually high interest rates to attract deposits across Europe, drawing in billions from foreign customers. The strategy worked for a while, producing sharp increases in assets and a sense of limitless opportunity. Gudmundsson's personal wealth expanded in tandem, and Iceland's banks briefly seemed capable of competing with the largest institutions in London or New York. The country's entire financial sector became deeply concentrated, far larger than its economy could realistically support. The global financial crisis in 2008 exposed that imbalance immediately. When credit markets froze and investors withdrew funds, Iceland's overextended banking model unraveled. Landsbanki could not meet its obligations and was taken over by the government along with the country's other major banks. With the collapse of his flagship institution, Gudmundsson's personal fortune evaporated. By 2009, he declared bankruptcy, reporting debts in the hundreds of millions of pounds. His ownership stake in West Ham was forced into a sale, leaving him without both his most visible investment and much of his credibility. Gudmundsson's downfall carried lessons far beyond Iceland. His personal collapse was inseparable from a national financial system that had ballooned without sufficient safeguards. When banking assets and liabilities became too large relative to the underlying economy, the entire structure was vulnerable to external shocks. For investors and ordinary savers alike, the warning is clear. Avoid concentrating too much exposure in the same sector or geography, because when systemic stress arrives, assets that seem independent can fail simultaneously. Diversification must account not only for industries, but also for the correlations that emerge during crises. This cautionary tale of overstretch and systemic fragility set the stage for other stories where bold expansion and high ambition promised far more than reality could deliver. Aubrey McClendon, the Energy Cowboy's final ride. Aubrey McClendon, often called the Energy Cowboy, became one of the most influential figures in America's shale gas boom. As co-founder and CEO of Chesapeake Energy, he drove the company's rapid rise by aggressively securing drilling rights and paying premium prices for land leases. His bold acquisitions earned him fame as a modern oil baron, and by the mid-2000s his net worth was reported in the billions. Investors saw him as both a visionary leader and a symbol of America's natural gas revolution. The growth carried a hidden cost. Chesapeake built its empire on layers of borrowing, taking on massive debt to fuel its expansion. McClendon personally mirrored this approach, borrowing heavily against his stakes in energy projects, which amplified his own exposure. When natural gas prices weakened and volatility returned, the company's financial commitments became unsustainable. What had been celebrated as daring strategy soon appeared reckless compared to rivals who had avoided such extreme leverage. By the early 2010s, Chesapeake faced mounting skepticism about whether its balance sheet could withstand the pressure. That pressure intensified in 2016 when federal prosecutors indicted McClendon on charges of conspiring to rig bids for oil and gas leases. According to the indictment, he had coordinated with competitors during auctions, limiting fair competition in a vital energy market. The charges threatened not only his reputation, but also the possibility of a long prison sentence and steep financial penalties. One day later, McClendon was killed in a car crash in Oklahoma City when his SUV struck a highway embankment. Investigators reported he had been traveling at high speed, but no final conclusion was made about motive. His sudden death ended the criminal case and brought an abrupt close to a career defined by both immense ambition and controversy. By the time of his death, McClendon's finances had deteriorated. Years of debt-funded expansion and personal borrowing meant his net worth was reported close to zero, despite once being worth over $1 billion. His story underscores a pointed lesson. When executives borrow heavily against their own business stakes, they compound both personal and corporate fragility. From America's energy boom to India's liquor and airline empire, the dangers of aggressive borrowing and unchecked ambition reveal themselves in different ways. Vijay Mallya, the king of good times gone sour. Vijay Mallya earned the title King of Good Times as one of India's most flamboyant billionaires, combining wealth with a lavish public persona. He inherited United Breweries from his father and expanded it into a dominant force in the liquor market, with Kingfisher beer becoming a nationally recognized brand. His fortune grew to more than $1.5 billion, and his lifestyle, fast cars, cricket sponsorships, and extravagant parties, seemed to embody unshakable success. Looking to broaden his empire, Mallya launched Kingfisher Airlines in 2005. At first it drew praise for its style and service, showcasing India's rising economic confidence. But the business model relied on continual borrowing rather than sustainable cash flow. Expansion into international routes, coupled with rising fuel costs and fierce competition, made the airline increasingly fragile. By the early 2010s, Kingfisher Airlines was drowning in debt, struggling even to pay salaries, and its collapse dragged United Breweries into deeper financial strain. As the airline's debts mounted, Indian banks pursued repayment of billions in loans. Investigators accused Mallya of misusing borrowed funds, moving them outside the airline's intended purposes. The figure tied to these allegations reached about $1.3 billion. Years of legal scrutiny followed, and the once celebrated industrialist soon became a poster figure for reckless borrowing and financial misconduct. In 2016, as creditors and regulators closed in, Mallya departed India for the United Kingdom. Authorities argued that he had fled to escape accountability, while Indian courts began an extended fight for his extradition. He has remained in London ever since, contesting proceedings that continue to this day, with British authorities designating his return contingent on the resolution of ongoing legal matters. Meanwhile, his fortune has been consumed by frozen assets, lawsuits, and the costs of protracted litigation. The billionaire whose empire once stretched from fine liquor to Formula One teams could no longer command the wealth or mobility that defined his public image. Mallya's downfall shows how reputation cannot substitute for financial discipline, and how legal exposure can erase both access to liquidity and the freedom to operate. From glamorous lifestyles to fragile foundations, fortunes can unravel within years, a reality that appears in some of the most unexpected personal stories of wealth loss. Patricia Kluge, the divorced billionaire's bust. Patricia Kluge's turn in the spotlight began with a large divorce settlement from John Kluge, then the richest man in America. What she gained was not just money, but assets. Albemarle House, a 45-room estate in Virginia with manicured grounds, plus a winery and other holdings that seemed to secure her future as an independent billionaire. For a time, Her life embodied the image of wealth successfully transitioned into new ventures. The winery became her signature project. It added glamour and credibility to her image as both a socialite and an entrepreneur, attracting visitors eager to sample premium wines against an opulent backdrop. Encouraged by early recognition, she expanded into real estate, proposing to carve parts of the estate into luxury subdivisions. On paper, the plan connected perfectly with a growing housing market and the demand for upscale country living. By debt financing land development while continuing to maintain the lavish estate, she bet heavily that her timing would match long-term trends. Then the 2008 financial crisis arrived. Demand for luxury property froze, buyers vanished, and what should have been a high-margin project instead drained capital at an alarming pace. The winery, already expensive to operate, also struggled as discretionary spending contracted. Cash flow collapsed, yet the financial obligations remained. Unlike larger corporations that could restructure, her ventures leaned heavily on borrowing and personal guarantees. Each missed sale or delayed payment translated into mounting pressure. The unraveling was swift. To cover debts, she sold Albemarle House, once the centerpiece of her fortune, for far below its perceived value. She filed for bankruptcy protection, her winery changing hands in a deal later involving Donald Trump. The woman who once embodied wealth through lifestyle assets had been undone by overexposure to cyclical markets at exactly the wrong moment. Her story underscores a clear lesson. Transforming a windfall into sustainable wealth demands more than eye-catching projects. High-end real estate and luxury consumer goods are vulnerable to downturns, and lavish personal portfolios amplify the risk. Avoiding heavy leverage in cyclical industries is critical because sudden shifts in demand can erase even the most impressive fortunes. Some failures unfold gradually through misjudged investments, while others are rooted in false numbers from the very beginning. Bernie Ebbers, WorldCom's fictional fortune. Bernie Ebbers built one of the most infamous corporate mirages of the late 1990s. As the driving force behind WorldCom, he pursued a streak of acquisitions that turned the company into a dominant player in telecom. On the surface, it looked like a classic story of aggressive growth meeting a booming market. Analysts applauded the strategy, investors poured in capital, and Ebbers' personal wealth soared to an estimated $1.4 billion. For a brief moment, he was held up as the face of a communications revolution. The image collapsed when the company's finances were exposed. WorldCom had fabricated more than $11 billion in profits by reclassifying expenses as investments, inflating its earnings to appear more stable than they were. These accounting maneuvers turned routine operating costs into false assets, creating the illusion of consistent profitability. To the outside world, the numbers suggested that WorldCom had weathered downturns in the industry better than its peers. In truth, debt was mounting, costs were hidden, and much of the growth was engineered for appearances rather than substance. For several years, the scheme kept investors complacent. Shares of WorldCom continued rising while competitors struggled, reinforcing the idea that the company had discovered a safer model in a volatile market. Retirement accounts, pension funds, and individual savers increased their exposure, convinced they had found the most reliable name in telecom. The reckoning came in 2002 when regulators uncovered the false accounting. Within months, billions in market value evaporated, tens of thousands of jobs vanished, and small investors found their life savings decimated. For Ebbers, the personal consequences matched the corporate destruction. His paper fortune unraveled alongside the stock. Creditors pursued repayment, his properties were liquidated, and the man once hailed as a billionaire innovator faced trial. In 2005, he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy, a penalty that signaled the scale of corporate betrayal. By the time of his death in 2020, the wealth and reputation he had once commanded were long gone. WorldCom remains a defining example of how unchecked financial engineering can devastate entire investor communities. The most important lesson for individuals is to ask hard questions. Where do a company's profits actually come from, and are they supported by transparent, verifiable accounting? Unless the answers are clear, the numbers can conceal far more than they reveal. Just as accounting tricks can erase billions in corporate wealth, personal choices in spending and lifestyle can also shred fortunes that once seemed secure. Jocelyn Wildenstein, spending through $2.5 billion. Jocelyn Wildenstein's fortune began not with business success, but with one of the largest divorce settlements ever recorded. When her marriage to billionaire art dealer Alec Wildenstein ended in 1999, she received a settlement estimated at $2.5 billion, plus additional yearly payments. Almost overnight, she entered the ranks of the ultra-wealthy, with access to estates, artwork, and other assets that placed her among the richest women of her time. Rather than focus on preserving or growing this settlement, she leaned into spending at a scale few could sustain. Maintaining vast New York properties acquired during the divorce required immense upkeep, on top of a lifestyle marked by luxury purchases and high-profile visibility. She became known in social circles and the media for her distinctive appearance and a pattern of extravagant outlays that drew constant public fascination. For a while, the sheer size of her fortune seemed to protect her from consequence, but the structure of her wealth lacked stability. Compounding the problem was the fragility of her assets. Much of her art collection, which on paper supported her enormous net worth, proved overvalued. Some pieces were later found to be outright forgeries. This discovery devastated her balance sheet and ignited disputes with creditors. Legal battles intensified, including foreclosure proceedings tied to unpaid loans, raising questions about whether her real estate empire could survive. These pressures mounted into irreversible decline. By 2018, Wildenstein formally filed for bankruptcy, disclosing she had no money in her accounts and was living entirely on borrowed funds. She acknowledged debts that wiped out what once looked like generational wealth. The Albemarle estate from her divorce, once a symbol of security, was eventually sold as part of her collapse, underscoring how quickly material fortunes can be undone. Her trajectory offers a sharp reminder. Sudden windfalls require discipline, planning, and professional stewardship. Divorce settlements, inheritances, or any other one-time gains can vanish without a strategy for preservation. Extravagant spending and illiquid or misvalued assets accelerate decline, leaving little behind even from billions. Not every billionaire's disappearance from the wealth rankings comes from mismanagement or fraud, however. Some choose a different path, giving up their fortune deliberately, with intention rather than circumstance. Chuck Feeney, the billionaire who gave it all away. Chuck Feeney provides one of the rare cases where great wealth was dismantled through choice rather than collapse. As co-founder of Duty Free Shoppers, he helped pioneer the booming luxury retail industry in airports during the 1960s and 70s. His stake in the company made him enormously wealthy, and by the early 1980s his net worth was estimated at around $8 billion. Unlike many peers who spent lavishly on yachts or estates, Feeney redirected his fortune with a deliberate plan to move nearly all of it into philanthropy during his lifetime. He called the approach giving while living. His reasoning was simple. Money could accomplish more if put to work immediately rather than being managed after death. Through the Atlantic Philanthropies, a foundation he established quietly in 1982, Feeney began channeling billions into education, science, public health, and human rights initiatives around the world. For decades, this work drew relatively little attention. He insisted his donations often remain anonymous and resisted publicity. His personal lifestyle reflected the same philosophy. Despite controlling billions in assets through his foundation, he chose to live simply. He often flew in economy class, carried his essentials in a plastic shopping bag, and avoided the traditional symbols of billionaire wealth. Few outside his inner circle realized just how much money he was giving away until much later, when foundations and universities acknowledged sums that had transformed their capabilities. By September 2020, Feeney completed his goal. The Atlantic Philanthropies shut down operations after distributing its remaining funds, having granted away nearly the entire $8 billion fortune. Reports noted he kept only about $2 million to provide modest retirement security for himself and his wife. In practical terms, he showed that it was possible for a billionaire to intentionally erase their fortune without scandal, collapse, or inheritance battles. Only a commitment to redirecting wealth into lasting projects. His story offers a different type of lesson. Where others struggled to preserve wealth through speculation or expansion, Feeney showed the impact of purpose-driven allocation. The underlying takeaway is that wealth always carries an end use, whether deployed deliberately into long-term causes or consumed involuntarily by risk and leverage. The next example swings sharply back to the latter, where hidden bets multiplied risk quietly until, in the span of 2 days, one man's $30 billion fortune disappeared almost entirely. Bill Hwang, the invisible $30 billion implosion. Bill Hwang's collapse stands as one of the clearest reminders of how hidden leverage can destroy enormous wealth with remarkable speed. For years, he operated outside the public spotlight. Yet within financial circles, he controlled capital on a scale that rivaled some of the biggest hedge funds. Through Archegos Capital Management, structured as a family office, he quietly built exposure that left estimates of his personal net worth in the billions, even though few beyond Wall Street knew his name. The key to Archegos' rise was its ability to use derivatives to mask the sheer size of its positions. Rather than buying shares directly, Hwang relied on total return swaps arranged through prime brokers. These contracts gave him synthetic exposure to company stocks, while keeping his name off public shareholder registers. Because the trades were spread across multiple global banks, no single lender realized just how much exposure Archegos had amassed. Positions reached concentrated levels in just a handful of companies, including Viacom CBS and several Chinese technology firms. The arrangement looked profitable while markets were climbing. Borrowed money allowed Archegos to multiply its bets, and rising share prices inflated both account values and perceived personal wealth. Behind the scenes, however, those same loans created vulnerability. Concentration combined with margin left Hwang exposed to even modest declines. In March 2021, Viacom CBS announced a large share sale. Its stock dropped sharply, triggering margin calls across Hwang's lenders. Archegos could not meet the demands, and the entire structure collapsed within days. The unraveling cascaded through the financial system. Prime brokers, including Credit Suisse and Nomura, began unloading tens of billions in positions tied to Archegos, dumping stock into the market at once. While some counterparties contained their losses, Credit Suisse alone reported more than $5 billion in damage, part of what made this one of the largest trading debacles in recent history. For Hwang, the fire sale erased his fortune almost instantly. The man who had quietly controlled tens of billions in exposure was left with nothing. The collapse highlighted a critical weakness in oversight. A lightly regulated family office was able to borrow sums that threatened global banks, all without broad disclosure. The lesson for individuals is clear. Leverage magnifies both gain and loss, and unless you understand how much visibility you and your counterparties have, risks may be far higher than they appear. Other billionaires would see their reputations vanish not through hidden trades, but through highly visible promises, like pledges in philanthropy that collapsed once their wealth disappeared. Alberto Villar, the patron who became a prisoner. Alberto Villar became widely recognized not for technology or real estate, but for his patronage of the arts. Known as a billionaire supporter of opera and classical music, he pledged large sums to major cultural institutions across the United States and Europe. His name appeared on opera houses and performing arts centers, giving him a reputation as one of the world's leading arts benefactors. Behind those pledges, however, was a financial empire heavily linked to the volatile technology sector, an empire that would collapse as quickly as it rose. Villar made his fortune through Amarindo Investment Advisors, a firm specializing in technology stocks during the internet boom of the 1990s. For nearly a decade, Amarindo thrived as investors rushed into anything connected to the dot-com economy. Companies with little more than internet-driven growth stories produced outsized returns, and Villar's fund captured much of that momentum. His personal fortune reached into the billions, enabling him to not only fund a luxurious lifestyle, but also make multi-million-dollar commitments to institutions like the Metropolitan Opera and the Royal Opera House. The picture changed with the dot-com crash in 2000. When technology stocks lost much of their value, Amarindo's holdings plunged alongside them. The collapse devastated Villar's net worth, as most of his wealth was tied directly to the same investments he managed for clients. Despite the decline, he continued making high-profile pledges to cultural institutions even as his financial base weakened. Many of those institutions later found themselves left without promised donations, forcing budget cuts and emergency fundraising to cover the shortfall. In 2005, the situation escalated when U.S. prosecutors charged Villar with securities fraud for misusing client funds. The charges included wire fraud and money laundering, pointing to a pattern of taking money intended for investment and instead applying it toward his personal obligations and ongoing pledges. For clients, the fraud compounded their market losses, turning temporary downturns into permanent financial damage. Villar was eventually convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. By the time his sentence ended, the fortune that once made him a cultural power broker had completely evaporated. What remained was a cautionary history of how philanthropy, when backed by unstable finances and poor stewardship, can mask deep structural risks. His story underscores the importance of scrutinizing both financial managers and the promises they make, no matter how prestigious their names appear. From the art world to global property markets, similar patterns played out as other once-celebrated tycoons faced collapse when their ventures and reputations collided with financial reality. Ramesh Chandra, real estate giant in ruins. Ramesh Chandra's trajectory in India's real estate boom illustrates how rapid growth can unravel when governance falters. Rising alongside the country's urban expansion, he positioned Unitech as one of the most prominent developers in the nation, with projects spanning Delhi, Noida, and other fast-growing hubs. For a time, glossy brochures and ambitious towers told a story of prosperity, and buyers saw Unitech as a trusted name in residential and commercial development. The optimism proved short-lived. Customers who had poured savings into new homes began reporting delays and uncertainty over project deliveries. Investors raised alarms about opaque accounting and how funds were being routed within the company. Regulatory probes followed, with officials scrutinizing whether customer advances were used for construction or diverted elsewhere. What had been marketed as a safe bet on India's housing market instead left many with half-finished apartments and mounting losses. As confidence slipped away, Unitech's market value collapsed. Shares that once represented one of India's hottest real estate names fell to a fraction of their earlier levels. Creditors froze assets, debt repayments became unmanageable, and liquidity vanished. The symbol of growth quickly turned into a cautionary case study. Construction sites that had once showcased India's economic rise stood unfinished, and trust in the company evaporated almost entirely. Within a few years, Chandra's paper fortune had largely disappeared. The collapse soon reached beyond balance sheets. Ramesh Chandra and his sons faced direct legal action amid findings of mismanagement and diversion of funds. He ultimately faced criminal charges and imprisonment, marking a dramatic fall for a businessman who once stood at the center of India's booming property sector. The empire built on real estate ambition had disintegrated, replaced by lawsuits, stalled assets, and reputational damage difficult to recover from. The central lesson for investors and buyers is clear. In real estate, oversight and ethical governance matter as much as market demand. A glossy exterior cannot compensate for weak financial discipline or poor accountability. Without transparency, even vast empires can collapse under their own weight. While Chandra's decline unfolded over years of missed deliveries and legal battles, other fortunes have disappeared in much shorter windows, including cases where billions were wiped away in a single trading session. Hwang, the umbrella billionaire's one-day disaster. Hwang fortune was unusual from the start. As chairman of China Jiqing Holdings, a Hong Kong umbrella manufacturer, he built wealth not through glamour or cutting-edge technology, but through control of a niche consumer product. For years, his concentrated holdings in the company's stock quietly elevated him into billionaire status, making him one of the more unlikely figures on Asia's rich lists. That status, however, was entirely dependent on the paper value of those shares. In a single trading session, that foundation collapsed. When a chain of defaults in related companies rippled through the market, confidence around Jiqing evaporated. Its stock price fell with extraordinary speed, and because Hwang's fortune was tied almost entirely to those holdings, his net worth shrank by billions in hours. Analysts noted it as one of the sharpest one-day personal wealth destructions in Hong Kong's market history. The numbers that followed were debated. Some reports suggested his billionaire status was wiped out altogether. Others argued he retained around $115 million, a significant sum, but only a fraction of his prior wealth. Whether the final figure was zero or merely reduced, the reputational effect was the same. Someone once described as a billionaire had lost most of his fortune before markets even closed. The speed of the collapse underscored how fragile such concentrated positions can be. Wealth based on a single stock depends on far more than company earnings. It rests on liquidity, broader market confidence, and the assumption that large shareholders can sell without driving prices down further. Hwang's fall showed what happens when those conditions fail all at once. An industry built on something as steady as umbrellas proved no protection against market shocks. For investors of any size, the lesson is straightforward. Avoid letting a single stock dominate your portfolio. Diversification is not simply about spreading risk across industries, but about ensuring no single fall can erase years of progress. Liquidity matters, and over-reliance on one company, especially where personal or family wealth is tightly concentrated, creates risks that cannot be ignored. Stories like Hwang's remind us that while markets destroy wealth with ruthless efficiency, often the greater danger lies in the decisions individuals make about how to hold and protect what they have. The psychology behind billionaire self-destruction. Why do some billionaires, after reaching heights few can imagine, make choices that bring about their own collapse? The answer often lies not in market cycles, but in psychology. Once enormous success is reached, the very traits that created wealth, confidence, boldness, risk tolerance, can evolve into destructive patterns when no guardrails are in place. The first pattern is overconfidence. After a fortune is built, it's easy to believe that instincts will continue working forever. Jesse Livermore is a clear example. He made millions by spotting market crashes early, but each win convinced him to press harder. He piled on leverage beyond reason, convinced his skill would save him. Instead, he went bankrupt multiple times, unable to recognize that past success offered no guarantee of future safety. The second pattern is risk addiction. Money can dull the fear of loss, and for some, taking bigger gambles becomes part of the identity. Vijay Mallya embodied this when he expanded far beyond liquor into an airline he could not afford. The thrill of expansion carried him further into debt, and while the highs were real, the liabilities eventually consumed his empire. For him, the chase itself became more powerful than the discipline needed to preserve wealth. The third and most damaging pattern is the inability to stop. At extreme wealth levels, pressure from boards or advisors often weakens, and few people will say no to a billionaire. Without boundaries, ambitions spiral unchecked. This appeared across multiple stories in this list, from Neumann's overreach at WeWork to Hwang's hidden leverage at Archegos. The absence of external brakes turned recoverable mistakes into final disasters. The psychological lesson is simple. If you hit big, impose structure before your habits trap you. Independent audits, enforced limits, or trusted advisory committees keep ambition in check. Confidence alone, no matter how well earned, cannot guard against hidden blind spots. Of course, individual psychology is only one side of the story. Sometimes, a fortune is undone not by personal habits or markets at all, but by conflict inside the family circle itself, where rivalries and inheritance battles carve empires apart. When families break fortunes, Ambani brothers. The story of the Ambani brothers remains one of the clearest examples of how unclear succession can fracture even the strongest dynasties. When Dhirubhai Ambani, founder of Reliance Industries, died in 2002, without leaving a will, India's most powerful business empire was suddenly without direction. What he left behind was a thriving conglomerate, but no defined structure for who would lead. His sons, Mukesh and Anil, both highly ambitious, stepped into the void, and competing visions quickly escalated into conflict over control. The rivalry threatened to split Reliance apart, until their mother, Kokilaban Ambani, intervened. Acting as mediator, she divided the empire between her two sons in 2005. Mukesh retained the energy and petrochemicals businesses, while Anil was given telecommunications, infrastructure, and financial services. At the time, the deal was framed as a solution that would allow each to focus on separate sectors while preserving the family's legacy. To outsiders, it looked like a compromise that could protect both fortune and reputation. But the years that followed showed just how different the two paths would be. Mukesh's strategy emphasized scale anchored in long-term investments. He expanded Reliance Industries steadily, later pushing into retail and digital networks. Each venture reinforced the others, creating multiple revenue streams that turned Reliance into one of the most valuable companies in the world. His personal fortune surged, placing him among the planet's wealthiest individuals. Anil's empire, by contrast, leaned heavily on borrowing and aggressive bets. His telecom businesses lost ground in an intensely competitive market, while infrastructure ventures struggled under debt. Regulatory pressure and missed targets compounded the problems. By the early 2010s, Anil's net worth had shrunk so dramatically that he moved from being one of the world's richest people to declaring liabilities that exceeded his assets. The divide between the brothers' fortunes became a stark lesson in how governance and decision-making shape outcomes, even when beginnings are shared. For families building wealth across generations, this case highlights the critical importance of planning. Clear succession structures and governance systems make it harder for disputes to turn into disasters. If you plan to create assets meant to last, establish those safeguards early, before ambition or rivalry can redefine the legacy. And while family conflicts can quietly drain fortunes, today there is a new, faster kind of exposure. Billionaires now face a world where reputations and fortunes are tested not just in boardrooms, but in real time under the glare of global audiences. How social media amplifies modern downfalls. In today's markets, perception can shift with a single post. Social media has become more than commentary. It actively shapes how markets react and how quickly confidence evaporates. When losses begin, platforms like Twitter, Reddit, and TikTok often turn private financial trouble into a public storyline, spreading doubt at a speed no press conference can match. The faster a narrative spreads, the harder it becomes to contain, especially when investor trust is tied more to reputation than to hard numbers. SAM BANKMAN-FRIED's collapse at FTX is perhaps the clearest example. As the exchange faltered, memes and threads mocking his eccentric persona circulated globally, reinforcing doubt not only in his leadership, but in the platform itself. Customers rushed to withdraw assets, not only because filings suggested solvency issues, but because the online narrative convinced many that the end had already arrived. Confidence disappeared almost overnight, accelerated by the very visibility that had once helped him court investors. The Archegos implosion in 2021 showed a similar dynamic, though less tied to a public-facing personality. As news broke that Hwang's oversized positions were unraveling, social platforms amplified rumors about which prime brokers were most exposed. Within days, panic wasn't limited to Archegos. It spread to counterparties like Credit Suisse and Nomura. Forced sales triggered billions in losses, and what might once have been a contained hedge fund failure instead became a cascade viewed in real time by investors and analysts online. Social media did not create the leveraged risk itself, but its amplification magnified the fallout. For modern billionaires and founders, that amplification is the key risk. Public chatter doesn't stop at embarrassing headlines. It directly influences market behavior. Business partners delay decisions, lenders tighten terms, and employees reconsider commitments once the dominant online story is one of collapse. In a digital economy, the reputational spiral often races ahead of the slower mechanics of insolvency. For anyone building or investing in public-facing ventures, the takeaway matters. Transparency in disclosures and proactive communication reduce the chance that a viral narrative pushes events faster than fundamentals dictate. In an environment where confidence is currency, how the story spreads may be as important as what the numbers show. And just as perception can strip wealth quickly online, risk grows even more dangerous when vast fortunes are tied to a single bet without protection. The diversification lesson, all eggs in one basket. A fundamental rule of finance is one that even the wealthiest often neglect. Real protection comes from diversification. It is the quiet safeguard that spreads risk across different sectors, instruments, and counterparties, ensuring no single failure has the power to erase an entire fortune. When this principle is ignored, the outcome can be swift and devastating, no matter the size of the balance sheet. Hwang illustrated this risk clearly. Through Archegos Capital, his wealth depended on oversized stakes in just a handful of companies, with some individual positions making up well over 10% of his portfolio. Leverage from global banks amplified the exposure. When just one stock, Viacom CBS, began to slide, his lenders demanded repayment he couldn't meet. The chain reaction wiped out more than $30 billion in market value within days, leaving nothing of his once enormous paper fortune. Quinn's experience in Ireland showed a similar danger in a different industry. Despite running a business empire that spanned cement, insurance, and energy, his personal bet on Anglo-Irish Bank became an overwhelming single point of failure. He borrowed heavily to finance the position, pledging much of his stronger businesses as collateral. When the bank collapsed during the financial crisis, Quinn's broader empire collapsed with it, dragging him from richest man in Ireland to bankruptcy. Together, these stories underline a simple reality. Even billions can be undone by dependence on a single holding. Concentrated bets magnify risk in ways that time and scale cannot dilute. Diversification does not guarantee profits. It limits the damage when one segment fails. By distributing exposure across different assets and industries, losses in one area can be countered by stability in another. For individual investors, the practical takeaway is clear. Avoid allowing one position to dominate your portfolio. If a single stock, sector, or counterparty represents most of your capital, consider drawing the line and rebalancing. Diversification is not a luxury. It is survival, the one structural defense that history shows too many billionaires ignored. And ignoring these basics is not limited to portfolio choices. Repeated patterns emerge in wealth destruction, where other simple financial rules were set aside with equally destructive consequences. Wealth protection strategies they ignored. Wealth protection strategies are simple in principle, but time and again billionaires failed to apply them. The vast resources they controlled created an illusion that fundamental rules didn't matter, and that illusion has cost fortunes. 3 recurring blind spots stand out: excessive leverage, unchecked spending, and weak succession planning. Each shows how even extraordinary wealth can vanish without basic safeguards. Overleveraging. Borrowing heavily to magnify returns can bring quick gains, but it also multiplies losses. Bill Hwang's family office, Archegos Capital, relied on borrowed money and complex swaps to carry oversized investments. When markets turned, margin calls triggered a collapse that wiped out tens of billions in days. His story illustrates how debt makes even the largest numbers fragile when a single position moves against you. Reckless spending. Luxury lifestyles can erode wealth faster than most imagine, especially when they solidify into permanent obligations. Jocelyn Wildenstein entered her divorce settlement with an estimated $2.5 billion, yet years of exorbitant real estate costs, spending on art that turned out to be misvalued, and constant cash burn left her bankrupt by 2018. What looked inexhaustible proved easy to drain when spending accelerated without limits. Weak estate planning. Family wealth that lacks structure doesn't last long, no matter how large it begins. The Ambani brothers' feud after their father's death underscored how fragile empires are without clear governance and succession. Their mother's intervention eventually split Reliance Industries between Mukesh and Anil, but their diverging fortunes revealed the risks of leaving succession unclear. Without plans, heirs often struggle, litigate, or dismantle the assets meant to sustain them. The lessons here are straightforward, but often ignored. Diversify across assets so no single loss destroys everything. Control leverage instead of assuming growth will continue endlessly. Keep spending aligned with sustainable income rather than treating wealth as an open tap. And most crucially, structure assets so they can survive past one individual's decisions. If you are building wealth today, apply these same protections on whatever scale you can. Consult an independent advisor about safe leverage limits and lay the groundwork for estate planning early. The hardest part is not reaching wealth, but making sure it lasts. Across these stories, the evidence is clear. The absence of discipline is often the starting point of decline. In every case, the downfall of billionaires carried lessons that apply far beyond the ultra-wealthy. Extreme fortune may look invincible, but it often unravels because simple rules were ignored. The same safeguards that protect everyday investors are the ones most often overlooked. 3 stand out. Diversify so no single asset can sink you. Limit leverage so borrowed money does not magnify losses. Insist on governance and independent oversight so decisions cannot spiral unchecked. Which fall surprised you most? And what would you do differently with sudden wealth? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more practical finance lessons.